The bulldozer didn't hesitate. Its blade bit into the nose of the jet fighter with a dull, grinding roar. Aluminum screamed. Wings buckled. A cockpit that had taken years of research to perfect folded like paper and vanished into a heap of twisted metal. Nobody shouted. Nobody tried to stop it. Men in oil-stained overalls just watched for a second, then turned back to their work. To them, it was just another airframe on a long list of machines that had to die. What almost no one on that airfield understood was brutally simple. They were erasing one of the most advanced air forces on Earth, and with it, most of the physical evidence of how the Second World War in the air had really been fought. For the Luftwaffe, this was the end. But the story of how it got here started much earlier, in the last days of a dying Reich, when Germany's air force didn't go out in a blaze of glory. It just stopped. In early May 1945, as Germany collapsed, there was no final apocalyptic air battle over Berlin. There was silence. Fuel had run out. Command chains had snapped. Maintenance crews had no parts and no orders. By the time German capitulation took effect on the 8th of May, the air force that had once dominated European skies was scattered across the continent like a wrecked machine, still recognizable, but no longer alive. Aircraft stood abandoned on airfields from Norway to Austria. Some were intact, canopies closed, guns still mounted as if waiting for pilots who would never return. Others sagged on flat tires, stripped for parts, missing engines or control surfaces, damaged by bombing raids that had never quite finished the job. They were the leftovers of a force that had been strangled slowly, not in a single defeat, but over months of fuel shortages, smashed railways, and collapsing infrastructure. Across northern Germany, key hubs like Flensburg and Lübeck were carpeted with grounded aircraft. Hangars looked like aircraft catalogs thrown onto concrete. Some shapes were familiar. Messerschmitt, Bf 109s, Focke-Wulf Fu 190s, Heinkel He 111's bombers. Others looked like they had come from a different decade. In Prague, hangars held rows of Messerschmitts and Heinkels beside late-war prototypes. At Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's main testing center, Allied investigators opened the doors of a treasure vault. Experimental airframes, wind tunnel models, and stacks of technical documents showing just how far Germany had pushed jet and rocket research. The variety shocked many Allied officers. Yes, the old workhorses were there. Bf 109 CFW-19 OS Ju-52 transports. But parked beside them were advanced machines like the Erdo R-234 jet bomber, the Heinkel He 162 Volksjäger, and the forward-swept-wing Junkers Ju-287 bomber project. Transport and reconnaissance aircraft, such as the Junkers Ju-52 and Heinkel He 111, lay scattered along fields and dispersal tracks. Many had simply been parked when the fuel ran out and never moved again. The war ended. The aircraft stayed. And in a ruined country that couldn't even feed its people, thousands of advanced machines suddenly became something else. A problem. By the end of May, the Luftwaffe wasn't just defeated. On paper, it barely existed. Its administrative structure had collapsed. Commanders surrendered wherever they happened to be. Ground crews walked away from their posts without formal orders. Maintenance logs were incomplete or destroyed. Fuel depots were bombed out or looted. Spare parts stores were burned or empty. From the Allied point of view, that chaos was dangerous. Nobody wanted rogue flights, last-minute escape attempts, or Nazi officials disappearing in unmarked transports. No one wanted one last desperate mission launched by men who refused to accept that the war was already over. So the Allied Control Commission moved quickly. They issued strict, unambiguous instructions. Every German aircraft was grounded. No German pilot could fly without explicit Allied authorization. Every takeoff required permission. For the first time since the 1930s, the German sky did not belong to the Luftwaffe at all. That's when a new battle began. Not in the air, but in offices and planning rooms. The question was simple and enormous. What do you do with the most advanced defeated air force on Earth? To some Allied officers, the answer was obvious. Destroy it. As long as those aircraft existed, someone might try to use them. Others saw something else. Opportunity. Germany had built technology years ahead of its time. Jet propulsion, high-speed aerodynamics, rocket research, advanced navigation and weapons systems. If those machines and documents vanished, so would their secrets. From the first days after the surrender, the future of those aircraft stopped being a military question and became one of intelligence, logistics, and politics. And the United States moved first. On May 9th, 1945, just one day after the formal capitulation, American intelligence teams launched an operation with a deceptively playful name. Operation Lusty, short for Luftwaffe Secret Technology. The name was light. The mission wasn't. Under Colonel Harold Watson, American teams fanned out across Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia with clear objectives. Find the most advanced aircraft. Secure their engines, systems, and documents. Ship the best of them back to the United States for testing. They moved fast. At Lechfeld in Germany, U.S. forces secured several intact Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighters. On those runways, American personnel could walk up to the aircraft that had terrified bomber crews in the last months of the war. At Grove Airfield in Denmark, they found Arado R-234 jet bombers and a mix of late-war prototypes parked in hangars and revetments. Anything considered valuable was either flown out by specially trained ferry pilots or dismantled for transport. Many airframes ended up at Wright Field in Ohio, where engineers tore apart engines and systems, documenting every performance parameter they could. Others went to Freeman Field in Indiana, where evaluation units cataloged equipment, engines, and design features. A small group of American pilots, nicknamed Watson's Whizzers, test flew captured jets under tight control. They wrote detailed reports on jet propulsion, swept wings, and high-speed handling. For the United States, this wasn't souvenir hunting. It was a shortcut into the future. The British took a parallel path, but with a different emphasis. Their effort, Operation Surgeon, wasn't just about capturing metal. It was about capturing minds. Teams from the Royal Aircraft Establishment moved into airfields at Fassberg, Schleswig, Husum, and Rechlin. They interviewed surviving engineers, test pilots, and technicians. They gathered blueprints, wind tunnel data, and experimental reports. Selected experts were quietly moved to British facilities to continue their work under new flags. At RAF Farnborough, British test pilots climbed into Me-262s to explore their handling, strengths, and weaknesses. They studied the Heinkel He-162, whose lightweight, quickly manufactured design offered clues for future trainers and point defense interceptors. The British weren't just asking, "What did you build?" They were asking, "Who built it? And what else can they build for us?" The Soviet Union saw the same opportunity through a different lens. Their trophy brigades advanced into Saxony, Thuringia, Silesia, and Czechoslovakia, with clear orders: seize factories, airfields, and any German technology useful to Soviet industry and defense. Major production centers fell into their hands: the Avia works in Prague, Bf 109 assembly lines in Moravia, and facilities scattered across Central Europe. Aircraft were loaded onto trains and shipped east, along with tooling equipment and teams of German engineers and mechanics. Near Moscow and Leningrad, Soviet test pilots slipped into the cockpits of captured Mi-262s and R-234s, evaluating performance and absorbing details for their own early jet designs. The Cold War hadn't officially started yet, but the race to control German technology had. Competition was inevitable. Everyone wanted the rare, irreplaceable prototypes, the one-of-a-kind airframes that existed in ones and twos, and the incomplete experimental projects that hinted at what might have come next. Arguments broke out over who had rights to what, especially in central Germany, where American and Soviet forces had reached each other within days. Some aircraft changed hands more than once as front lines shifted, and occupation zones were finalized. The Allied Control Council tried to keep things orderly on paper, assigning zones and coordinating collection plans. But beneath the official cooperation, early Cold War tensions were impossible to miss. Each power wanted to leave Germany with as much of its research legacy as possible. In the middle of all this, German personnel became reluctant guides to their own defeat. Former pilots demonstrated gas start procedures for Jumo 004 jet engines. Mechanics explained maintenance quirks of the BMW 003. Engineers walked Allied officers through advanced navigation systems and weapons installations. Sometimes they did this as part of formal agreements, sometimes under heavy supervision, sometimes simply because cooperation meant food, shelter, and a faint hope of a future in a shattered country. Allied teams photographed everything. They copied blueprints, translated flight manuals, and compiled test reports. Every airframe that seemed important was measured, inspected, debated. Then came the hard choices. Which machines would be shipped abroad? Which would be kept briefly for study? And which, even if they were unique, would be written off as expendable? By late 1946, the first phase was over. Dozens of Luftwaffe aircraft had been shipped to the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Testing programs were underway. Engineers on 3 continents pored over German designs. The Allies had taken what they wanted. Now they turned to what they didn't. The order that sealed the fate of the rest didn't come with speeches or dramatic proclamations. It came on paper. By late 1945, the Allied Control Council issued a directive that decided the future of almost every German aircraft still standing. Everything that remained would be destroyed, not stored, not mothballed, not preserved for museums that mostly didn't exist yet. Eliminated. The logic was cold and simple. Germany would never again field a military air force without Allied permission, and anything left behind, fighters, bombers, transports, trainers, even prototypes, represented a potential future threat. So across Europe, airfields turned into graveyards. Some became the largest scrapyards the continent had ever seen. Flensburg, Lübeck-Blankensee, Grove, Tarnowitz. Airfields that had once launched combat missions became disposal hubs where British, American, and Soviet crews performed a task few history books like to describe in detail. Aircraft were lined up in rows, sometimes by the hundreds. Teams stripped them of weapons, electronics, radios, and engines. Wings came off. Control surfaces were removed. Fuselages were dragged into piles like fallen dominoes. The sound never really stopped, metal groaning under pressure, rivets popping, torches hissing as they sliced through aluminum that had once flown at 500 miles per hour. Some airframes were crushed directly under bulldozer blades. Others were burned in pits until nothing remained but puddles of hardened alloy. Some, especially in the north, were loaded onto barges and dumped into the sea. Many of those wrecks still lie underwater, discovered only occasionally by divers who recognize a bent propeller or the ghostly outline of a wing beneath the sand. They are the last untouched pieces of a vanished air force. Thousands of machines disappeared this way, and not just the cutting-edge jets. The order was absolute. Everything military had to go. Fighters like the Bf-109 and FW-190 were dismantled. Bombers like the Ju-88 and HE-111 were crushed. Jets like the Me-262 and R-234 were destroyed unless previously tagged for study. Even transport and training aircraft, such as the Ju-52 and R-96, were scrapped, unless special permission was granted. Some types sat awkwardly between civilian and military. The Ju-52, for example, had both commercial and wartime roles. A few were repurposed for transport in tightly controlled environments, but most still went to the scrap piles to keep the policy clean and simple. The scale of destruction is almost impossible to grasp today. What had taken Germany roughly a decade to build was erased in less than 3 years. Czechoslovakia faced its own strange version of this story. In Prague, Kunovice, and Letňany, factories still held completed and semi-completed Luftwaffe aircraft. For a brief moment, engineers assembled some of them into operational fighters under new national designations. The most famous result was the Avia S-199, essentially a Bf-109 airframe fitted with a Jumo 211 engine. Difficult to fly, unforgiving in handling, and notorious among pilots, it nevertheless became the backbone of the new Czechoslovak Air Force. Some of these S-199s were even sold abroad, most famously to the young state of Israel in 1948, making them the first fighters of the Israeli Air Force. Those aircraft were no longer symbols of Nazi power. They were survival tools for nations rebuilding from rubble, but even they were temporary. As Soviet-built machines became available, the German-based designs were retired, dismantled, or scrapped like their predecessors. Spain followed a similar path with its own twist. Under a pre-war license, Spanish factories had built variations of the Bf-109. After the war, production continued in modified form, as the Hispano-Aviación HA-1112, equipped with different engines and Spanish avionics. These Spanish Messerschmitts stayed in service into the 1950s. Later, they became famous for an entirely different reason. They played the role of German fighters in movies, most notably in the Battle of Britain. Their silhouettes kept the Luftwaffe's image alive on screen, long after the original Air Force had disappeared. But again, this was an echo, not a continuation. The Luftwaffe as a fighting institution had ended in 1945. Only its shapes survived, briefly, under other flags. Norway also operated small numbers of captured Bf-109s and Arado trainers during its early post-war rebuilding period, but parts ran out quickly. Maintainers struggled to keep aircraft flying with no factories behind them, no supply chains, no official support. By the 1960s and 70s, the remaining airframes were no longer military assets. They were projects, stripped shells dragged into barns and workshops by enthusiasts who understood that Europe had almost erased its own aviation history. Civil aviation borrowed fragments, too. The rugged Junkers Ju 52, a pre-war transport, saw brief post-war life in France, where the Toucan variant served in colonial operations. Lufthansa itself used Ju 52s in the early 1950s as it clawed back into commercial service. But the jet age moved fast. Modern designs pushed the old tri-motors aside almost overnight. By 1956, when West Germany created the Bundesluftwaffe, not a single wartime Luftwaffe aircraft was seriously considered for service. Not one. Jet age standards had left them far behind. NATO partnerships demanded new hardware and new doctrine. The Bundesluftwaffe entered the sky in F-84 Thunderstreaks, Canadair Sabres, and later the infamous F-104 Starfighter, aircraft designed, built, or licensed by former enemies and new allies. German military aviation had been rebooted with a new identity that started not with Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf, but with treaties, alliances, and a very different world. Meanwhile, a smaller, quieter struggle was unfolding. Historians and enthusiasts watched in frustration as aircraft of enormous historical value were destroyed not because they were dangerous, but because no one had space, money, or political patience to keep them. Museums were tiny. Budgets were microscopic. Europe had cities to rebuild, people to house, railways to repair. To officials, airframes were scrap metal, not artifacts. Today, much of the academic debate around the Luftwaffe's legacy circles back to this period. How many unique designs were lost forever? How many prototypes disappeared before anyone could properly study them? How much irreplaceable history was bulldozed, burned, or sunk simply because it was in the way? The answers are uncomfortable. By 1948, the overwhelming majority of Luftwaffe aircraft, from the first Bf-109s to the last experimental jets, had been wiped from existence. Runways that once launched fighter groups turned into farmland, industrial estates, or NATO training grounds. Hangars were demolished or converted into warehouses. Within a few short years, the massive aviation infrastructure of the Third Reich hadn't just been defeated, it had been erased. And yet, even erasure leaves traces. By the second half of the 20th century, the Luftwaffe survived only in fragments, crash sites in forests, wrecks in lakes and bogs, buried engines uncovered by farmers' plows, twisted airframes excavated from the Eastern Front. Restorers trying to rebuild a single display aircraft often needed parts from 3 or 4 wrecks. Even then, many museum pieces today are composites, the closest possible reconstructions of designs that once existed in their thousands. In the modern era, only a tiny handful of original machines survive. A few Me-262s, a handful of Bf-109S, and FW-19OS. 1 or 2 Arado R-234s, a scattering of rare jets preserved in museums. Almost none of them fly. The few Luftwaffe aircraft that do are usually modern replicas, built from scratch to replicate the look and performance of machines whose original bones are simply too old, too fragile, and too rare to risk. What you see today in the museums of Washington, London, Munich, Prague, and beyond is just a whisper of what once was. A force raised in less than 10 years, destroyed in less than 3. The rest is gone, scrapped, melted, recycled into civilian life, or lying silent beneath the waves. They are ghosts now, metal shadows that remind us how even the most advanced machines can vanish when the world that built them collapses, and when the victors decide that forgetting is safer than remembering. If this story made you see the Luftwaffe differently, not just in combat over Europe, but in the scrapyards, conference rooms, and quiet decisions that erased it, consider subscribing to the channel. We bring back the hidden sides of World War II, the systems, the consequences, and the human choices that history class leaves out. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and which lost machine, from any nation, you'd save if you could bring just one back from the scrapyard.